Good day to everyone and welcome to the online launch of the Policy Research on Development Cooperation in Situations of Conflict and Fragility produced by the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness or the CPDE Working Group on Conflict and Fragility in partnership with the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation or IPMSDL, which hosts the Working Group Secretariat. The CPDE is an open platform of CSOs around the world to advocate for development aid that promotes sustainable change and addresses the root causes as well as the symptoms of poverty, inequality, and marginalization. This is the first research publication of the said working group, which was established by the CPDE to inform its engagements as well as of its constituencies as it relates to both direct and indirect use of ODA or official development assistance for war, security, military operations, and other conflict-inducing activities. The goal of the research is to evaluate development cooperation with respect to addressing the root causes of conflict and fragility in different countries and regions through various case studies. In this program, we'll be seeing the highlights, findings, and key recommendations from some of the case studies included in the collection. To give us an overview of the research content as well as to position the research collection in today's global context, we are joined by one of the working group co-chairs and also one of the CPDE co-chairs, Beverly Longid.
Good day. I am Beverly Longid, one of the co-chairpersons of the Working Group on Conflict and Fragility of the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness, or CPDE, and the Global Coordinator of the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for Self-Determination and Liberation, or IPM-SDL. I am very glad to join everyone today in launching our book, Policy Research on Development Cooperation in Situations of Conflict and Fragility. We thank those who supported this important endeavor, the European Commission and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, or SIDA. Without these organizations, we will not have the research collection that we are launching today. At the same time, we thank the researchers who submitted their papers for our publication. G. Amarjit of India, Pefi King, and Yusofo no Emano Peseta Betisio of the Pacific Islands, Charles Masabo of Burundi, Martha Mundi for Yemen, and Darius Okola of Kenya. Based on our researchers' contributions, our collection was able to gather diverse and concrete case studies that illustrate the relations between development cooperation on the one hand and militarism in situations of conflict and fragility on the other. Our research collection shows different ways that aid and militarism interact in concrete contexts. First is a case study where development cooperation is being used to soothe the effects of military attacks in a country. Second is a case study where it is used to prevent solutions to militarism in a global scale, in a global region. Third is a case study where aid refuses to directly engage in areas where conflicts rage, and when it does, it is usually aligned with government's militaristic approach as distinguished from socio-economic approach to the conflict. Fourth is a case study where an aid-funded short-term response to a conflict, despite not being effective to an extent, creates more problems pertaining to conflict and fragility. Finally, a case study where development cooperation helped end an armed conflict, but so many reforms still need to be implemented to actually improve on people's human rights. May these case studies serve as cautionary tales about how global powers and national elites use development cooperation in ways that contribute to militarism in situations of conflict and fragility, rather than solve this by upholding people's human rights, addressing the social, economic, and political causes of the conflict and fragility, and creating genuine development. Our contributors submitted their research papers before the current COVID-19 pandemic. In the remaining part of this message, I would like to make some observations about development cooperation on the one hand and militarism in situations of conflict and fragility on the other in the context of the current pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the weaknesses of the health and economic systems of all countries in the world, especially those in the global south. Poor and privatized health systems, widespread unemployment and informality, and lack of social protection and government funds all made immediate and effective response to the pandemic difficult for many countries. It is worth noting that if the pandemic has imposed hardship on all countries, including economically advanced ones, it has greater damage in countries like Yemen, which has been devastated by 5 years of war, and poor countries like Burundi. The pandemic has also dictated on governments, again, mostly of the global south, the need for a source for greater financing, including development cooperation. Apart from this, it has clarified to marginalized sectors where government funds and development cooperation should go. It should go to medical measures in response to the pandemic, improving healthcare systems, providing financial assistance to the unemployed, and safety nets to the working people, among others. At the same time, many governments in various parts of the world have resorted to more repressive and even militaristic actions in enforcing measures necessitated by the pandemic and in quelling opposition to such measures. Among the case studies, the governments of India and Kenya are striking examples. In this context, marginalized communities and civil society organizations continue to exert vigilance with regard to government's use of development cooperation. We should ensure that it upholds human rights and international humanitarian laws, that it is not spent for military purposes, but for social services and sound economic programs, that it addresses the root causes of the armed conflicts, and that discussions on it include civil society organizations. There are recent developments that carry impacts on development cooperation and conflict and fragility in the world. In March, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a global ceasefire among groups engaged in armed conflicts so that the world can confront the pandemic in a unified and effective manner. He reiterated this call in time for the UN's 75th anniversary in October, implying what observers say is the little effect created by his appeal with regards to conflicts the world over. On October 24, a 50th country has signed the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the first agreement to explicitly and officially prohibit the creation or procurement, testing, use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. The civil society organizations in the Pacific Islands are some of the staunchest campaigners of this treaty. While it is fueled by good intentions and contains positive provisions, however, the treaty does not compel nuclear-armed countries to comply with it. This November, US President Donald Trump lost in the elections. While defeating his highly repressive regime is considered a victory of the American people, the peoples of the world expect little change with regard to US military and international policy. There are many who fear that the US under a Joe Biden presidency will continue or even be more effective in being interventionist around the world. In 2021, the UN Secretary General will hold a food systems summit that is considered a part of the decade of action for achieving sustainable development goals by year 2030. The summit promises to launch bold new actions to deliver progress on all 17 SDGs. Expected to take center stage in this summit is Yemen, the face of famine in the world in the past decade. Despite these positive developments, many observers fear continued tendencies towards militarism, especially in situations of conflict and fragility. There is therefore a need to continue to oppose efforts at making development cooperation contribute to these tendencies. There's a need for CSOs and peoples around the world to respond to collective action. In the end, we hope that the book we are launching today, Policy Research on Development Cooperation in Situations of Conflict and Fragility, will help us inform and educate our ranks, as well as the ranks of the private sector and government, to ensure that development cooperation upholds human rights, humanitarian law, and genuine development for all countries, especially those in the Global South. Thank you very much.
Beverly Longid is joined by Razan Zuwaiter of the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature as co-chairs of the Working Group on Conflict and Fragility, and they co-authored the introductory note of the research publication. Moving on to our case study presentations, first stop is on development cooperation in the Pacific as it relates to the denuclearization campaign in the region. This was co-authored by Pepe Kingi and Usufono Imano, Peseta Betty Sio. This particular study was conducted through community consultations and collective discussions taking into account perspectives from the ground. It discusses how development cooperation came into play for and against one of the most important treaties in the region, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As an introduction to their study, let us first hear some of the recent updates on the ratification of this UN treaty, featuring some commentaries from Fijian academic Dr. Vanessa Griffin.
The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted on the 7th of July 2017 by 122 states in the United Nations General Assembly agreeing to this treaty which makes nuclear weapons illegal. The role of CSOs has been great in bringing about this treaty, and their long movement for many, many decades against nuclear weapons is well documented. In the Pacific Island region, we had the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement, which for decades fought against nuclear weapons testing. CSOs have a great opportunity to look at the treaty, to look at its contents. It has wonderful articles which explain the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons, but also it would be good to pay attention to Article 6 on victim assistance and environmental remediation. There's a role for CSOs across the Pacific in looking back again at our nuclear testing history and looking at how we may proceed and help our states, but also help our own communities and our own peoples who continue to suffer the intergenerational effects of nuclear weapons, to then become participants and supporters of this treaty, and to see how it can help the Pacific achieve nuclear justice. That might be a very big thing to ask. I hope CSOs may also look at cooperation and considering donor involvement in supporting CSO and Pacific states as they work on the implementation of this treaty, the exciting history that will now begin next year in January 2021.
For our next study, we have a slideshow presentation from Mr. Charles Masabo of l'Organisation Unisono pour la Promotion des Batwa, or the Organization for the Promotion of Unity Among the Batwa People of Burundi. His case study reviews the national government's demobilization and reintegration of former combatants in the country, while presenting how development cooperation provided support for this peace-building program. Weapons of war are not only limited to firearms and have gone on to denial of fundamental human rights and even to aid itself as a tool to breed dependence. One such notable case is the conflict and state of fragility in Yemen as presented by Dr. Martha Mundy of the Arab Group for the Protection of Nature. In her research note, she presents how an overwhelming proportion of aid to Yemen is from Saudi-led states, the same governments that profit from the coalition's acts of aggressions against Yemen, including the famine that now plagues its people.
Hello, I'm going to first give a short introduction this is Martha Mundy, the note on development effectiveness in Yemen, with special reference to food production. And then I will close with some remarks directed to development agencies and the policy to change the situation. The structure of the note, it begins by noting the near-famine conditions throughout much of Yemen, which should be well known to the readers. Second, it moves on to the nature of the conflict, which is not only a civil conflict, but is above all an international conflict, and how that relates to Yemen's strategic importance, and the siege and bombing focus on food production that has been part of that war, or that still remains to be as part of that war. Third, it moves on to the political economic background to development effectiveness from the 1970s onwards, when Yemen was essentially an agrarian economy. And fourth, notably from the early 1980s, how the country became under increasing dominance of the Western aid complex, as the regime of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who was himself a military man, meant that the Yemeni state became overwhelmingly a security state. What happened during the war to the development complex? Well, in 2015, March, the bombing began. And for the couple of weeks before then, and the first 18 months of the war, essentially the Western development agencies and the Washington development agencies pulled out. And then, after about 18 months, began to return in the form of humanitarian intervention. Finally, the note closes with looking at the emerging debate in Sana'a over the relation to the external development humanitarian complex and over the nature of a pre-existing agrarian policy. So let me close with just a few remarks concerning development policy today, as that is the thrust of the collection as a whole. And my remarks here are guided by Zaid Basha, who is the Yemeni author of a forthcoming report, Arabia Felix, The Rapid and Costly Transformation from Food Self-Sufficiency to Insecurity. Two remarks. First, today, the de-development of Yemen's agricultural sector continues to be misrepresented by development agencies. Regardless of whether this misreading is intentional or innocent, it continues to impede the task of putting the sector and the economy more broadly on the path of real development. Two examples. The first is attributing Yemen's persistent acute foods insecurity to wartime economic decline and other exacerbating but incidental factors. For instance, in July of this year, 2020, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, in its 22nd July briefing entitled Yemen Sees Return to Alarming Levels of Food Insecurity, identified several drivers of Yemen's food crisis. It mentioned economic shocks, conflict, floods, desert locusts, and COVID-19, while avoiding any mention of the root or more consequential causes. The second example is the ILO, the International Labour Organization's argument that the steady decline in employment in agriculture verifies the mainstream hypothesis that, quote, in the course of economic development, there is migration of workers from rural to urban areas, from agriculture and other labor-intensive primary activities to industry and then to services. But if Yemeni male labor's forced migration to the Gulf and the freeing of rural labor from the land of Yemen is a sign of the country's progress, then one truly wonders what a state of regress in human and physical capital in Yemen would look like. In short, a starting point for development aid would be a critical review of its contribution since 1980 to Yemen's de-development. Second and lastly, the relationship between Yemen's domestic markets and the international markets must be defined in a way that works for Yemenis before it works for global markets. And this is a remark directed not only to development agencies, but also to whatever state will come to assume power in the Yemen. This necessarily requires defining new rules of the game. Post-war Yemeni governments must understand that what is at stake is not profitability, but people's livelihood and dignity. Development agencies, on the other hand, must not continue to dictate agricultural policy in the agrarian South within the confinement of their present very narrow interpretation of economic growth. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy reading the note.
For our last presentation, we have Mr. Darius Okolia to speak on a study on the Dadaab refugee complex in northeastern Kenya. Here he looks into a refugee support program wherein he had noted its accomplishments in terms of responding to the immediate needs of the refugees, but at the same time going over the new peace and security challenges that it had created over time in its operation.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this opportunity to address you on these critical conversations. It's been a unique year in many ways. We've had to deal with the effects of the pandemic, its impact across very many issues, across many countries, across many jurisdictions and timelines, amidst many other issues, including the American elections, the recently concluded elections, or rather, the elections that are, and the counting and the entire political process around it. But also these issues speak into the reality of securitization of different aspects of human societies and human lives and human realities. And so this commonality of realities of issues, especially issues under securitization, is what puts us in a space where we're able to audit our realities globally, and we're able to exchange notes and share some of the different ways in which we are grappling with it. I, in particular, tackled securitization of humanitarian aid at the Dadaab complex. What is Dadaab complex? Dadaab complex is a 5 refugee camps built in Kenya in 1991. They were set up, rather established, ostensibly to help mostly the Somali community who are fleeing from the civil and clan wars that broke out in the early 90s, around 1991, after the fall of their former president, President Siad Barre. At its height, it was hosting about 450,000 people, which is 5 times its capacity. The camp, or rather the wider complex, has about 5 camps. They're known as Hagadera, Dagalei, Ifo, Ifo 2, and Cambios. They're also called Ifo East and Ifo West rather than Ifo and Ifo 2. All these are used interchangeably. Now, in terms of composition, there are about 95% Somalis in the camp. The complex is primarily overseen by, UNHCR, but there are about 46 other local and international humanitarian agencies in that space who provide food, education, security, logistical supports, financial help, women empowerment, agricultural support, tech support, and all kinds of emerging and evolving needs. The Dadaab's development cooperation strategy in relation to addressing its state of conflict and fragility, I would say it needs to be understood the uniqueness of this complex. These multiple refugee camps in one space, and the reality in which they were started and what they evolved into. So, there was the initial provision of makeshift camps to house refugees, who are fleeing the conflict in Somalia. But then after that, you have to deal with the expansion of refugee space to accommodate a second wave of immigrants that was around 2011 because of the major drought that happened in the Horn of Africa. And a lot of the people fled further west into Kenya and right into the camp. And then, of course, there's the further expansion to house the growing population due to births. These are people who arrived here in 1991. Those who were born in the immediate aftermath of that transition to, Dadaab, by now are 28, 29, 30 years. You basically have 3 generations in that camp, of which 2 generations were born there. So that in itself creates a very unique space, in terms of identity, belonging, location, sustenance, and of course the clan politics that comes up in that kind of a space. And then, of course, there's the external facilities built to house the logistical support, technical staff of these humanitarian agencies, which is built a bit further out from the camp, but constitutes a critical part of the wider Dadaab reality. And of course, it becomes right into the matrix, the securitization matrix of this space. And all this is, in many ways, has to be understood as both an evolution of the reality of what Dadaab is, was, and is going to become in the coming years and months as we go forward. Was the strategy of establishing this camp accomplished? I would say, depending on how you look at it could be a success, it could be a hit or a miss. The fact that the camp is still open in itself is, you'd say, a big miss, because it was started initially to house people, but again, and the unpredictability of civil and clan war at the scale that happened in Somalia in 1991 means you couldn't predict how long you're going to keep these people here, or how long these people are going to stay in these camp facilities. And so that way you would say it's a miss. But then there are different other ways of looking at it. You could say, okay, the entire wider complex constitutes about $25 million turnover, in terms of the provisions of goods and services, of trade and aid, and health facilities and social amenities, and agricultural facilities. All this totaling to about $25 million, annually, and that's a lot of money by any count. Then there's been a change in land use as regards, agricultural investments by about 200 households there under what is called a Dadaab Umbrella 1 and B, women's organizations. This, it helps these families set up kitchen gardens and to be able to do commercially viable agriculture within small spaces. It's a very unique example of trying to empower families at that basic level. And so that, you would say, is a win, because it helps lower the level of dependencies, especially on external agencies and aid for a lot of these families, and especially for women in the camps, and the unique nature of the kind of challenges women within refugee camps, and especially mothers within refugee camps, would face. But then across the border from where these people initially came in 1991, you have the relative stability that has come into the place because of the presence of AMISOM and other multinational peace units, army units, has meant that there have been 10 safe havens created within Somalia in the lower southern region to basically help people be able to, get back into their lives, get to be able to start to rebuild the communities that they fled from, infrastructurally, but also in terms of social relations, in terms of food sustenance, in terms of even identity and belonging, taking back kids who haven't been there for 30 years, who've literally grown up as adults without ever setting foot there, and now having to set foot there again. Within this kind of a context, one of the big things you always fall back on is you need these people educated, because it's the one opportunity for them to, be able to change, their fate and their reality within a generation. Would you say the policy succeeded or failed to address the root causes of the conflict? I would say the strategy is a stopgap measure that has extended far beyond its mandate. Shutting down the complex as the proper eventual tail end of the policy is what will constitute success. In the meantime, the creation of safe havens inside Somalia is a step towards success of the mission. But then we always have to look at the eventual closure. Of course, there's a lot of political realities and logistical dynamics and the nature of, the safety and security situation within Somalia that has to be taken into account. But all these add up to the one reality that you're dealing with multiple evolving realities here. You're dealing with the fact that these people have been here for so long. dealing with the fact that they are coming over there also upstages certain clan demographics, both for locals, that is Kenyans, but also for the refugee population. I think you'll have to look at these multiple realities and say, here, I think we failed. Here, I think the strategy is evolving towards, the final eventual closure of this place. Here, we might want to do more in terms of how do you deal with the threat of terror within that space? How do you deal with, sometimes the militarization of aid? How do you deal with the social and ethnic and xenophobic tensions between the locals and the people coming from outside? How do you deal with the social realities and identity of these kids and their sense of belonging, both within this country, back at home in their clans in Somalia, their space in the global order, especially in this day and age of social media and the global identities that we are crafting for ourselves, especially for the younger generation. So it is both a hit and a miss. It's a mixed bag of realities that cannot be simply boiled down into one reality. And so all these realities feed into this securitized element that needs, some sort of different levels of control, different levels of diplomacy and negotiation, different levels of conversation about the space of, refugee and displacement and the identity of the displaced and the evolving nature of the fact that they might be here for another 20 years, which means you might have 3 or even up to 4 generations born and bred here in Kenya. What becomes of that kind of people, especially when you're dealing with these numbers of 200,000-300,000 people? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Before summing up, I would also like to acknowledge Professor G. Amarjit Sharma with the Center for Research and Advocacy Manipur, who wrote on the role of development assistance in India in supporting the state's counterinsurgency operations in the country's conflict areas. You may read his research paper, along with the others presented earlier, in the full publication, which is now available for download in the CPDE and IPMSDL websites, which you can find the link for in the caption. Going back shortly to our co-chair's introductory message in this launch, she expressed how these studies should serve as precaution on how development cooperation can be put to tendencies towards militarism, but also through the proactive and effective CSO intervention can also promote and uphold human rights. This should also remind us to remain critical of stopgap measures that may sometimes prevent us from immediately recognizing the structural determinants of conflict and fragility, that is landlessness, resource extraction and plunder, and socioeconomic and gender inequalities, among others. We hope that the findings from this research strengthen our advocacy work and our calls to put people's rights at the heart of the discourse on development and peace as we engage with fellow CSOs, governments, private institutions, and other multi-stakeholder formations. So, on behalf of the Secretariat, the Working Group co-chairs, and the members of the Working Group, we extend our heartfelt thanks to all those who made this research publication possible. The authors, our content editors and consultants, the creative and layout team, and of course, we dedicate this project to the people who not only dream, but take action towards the achievement of just and lasting peace. Finally, for feedbacks, reviews, and questions for the authors, you may reach the Secretariat through our email, which you should be able to see now in your screens. So thank you again for joining us in this online launch, and happy reading to all.